This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. Two-thirds of the world's ocean area lies beyond any country's borders. These vast waters, known as the high seas, regulate our climate, store carbon, and host some of the planet's richest and least understood biodiversity. For decades, they've also been among the least protected parts of the planet. But that is about to change. A new UN agreement, often called the High Seas Treaty, is entering into force. After nearly 20 years of negotiations and a final push for ratification, the treaty marks a major moment for ocean governance and global cooperation. But what does it do? Who benefits from it? And will it really change what happens on the water? For these questions and more, we are joined by Zhang Yimo, Priority Project Coordinator of WWF China's Sustainable Blue Economy Program. Hi, Yimo. It's great to have you on our show.
Hi, Ms. Zhao. Thank you for having me.
To start with, could you briefly explain what we mean by high seas and why these areas matter for global biodiversity and climate stability?
Well, as a serious definition, high seas refer to the parts of the oceans that lie beyond any country's national jurisdiction. In other words, it is the water surface that no countries can claim under sovereignty by any legal means, like archipelago waters, continental shelf, or the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, etc. Essentially, high seas make up about two-thirds of the ocean and cover nearly half of the Earth's surface. High sea is important from many perspectives. It is not hard to imagine that the vast areas provide the largest habitats on Earth, and therefore it sustains huge potentials of biodiversity resources. Many species in the high seas are still not fully understood, including unique deep-sea creatures, microspecies like the whales and sharks, and important ecosystems like hydrothermal vents and sea mountains. High seas are critical for mitigating climate change. As a terrestrial species, we human beings have long been aware that forests are the lungs of Earth. However, it is less known that the high sea supplies us with almost half of the oxygen we breathe, mainly from phytoplanktons in the upper layers, and these planktons also lay foundations of the ocean ecosystems. In addition, the ocean's deep-sea areas act as a massive carbon sink, storing carbon dioxide over long periods. And after all, the ocean absorbs more than 90% of our excess heat and half of our carbon dioxide emissions. Also, I would invite our audience to think about the common notion on environmental protection. That is to protect the shared resource people use, like the collective protection of a public pasture that individual shepherds use. The value of empowering governments and policies, the breakdown of carbon quota, etc., all run under such scenarios. And now, we are talking about the high seas, the public areas that belong to no countries. In other words, it is a public water among publics. Bearing this in mind, and let's talk more about it.
Okay, so before this treaty, was this public area effectively a lawless zone?
Not actually. There are several international laws to regulate activities in the high seas, but mostly from a specific perspective. For example, the International Convention of the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, or MARPOL Convention, short for Marine Pollution, has been regulating the pollution from shipping industry since the 1978. And there are more of such attempts in another old industry, fishery. Countries started some bilateral fishery agreements since the 19th century. In modern times, organizations called RFMOs, or Regional Fishery Management Organizations, that regulate fishery activities in the high seas. China is also a member of about 10 of such RFMOs. Obviously, these treaties only focus on specific sectors and is far from enough for biodiversity conservation. To better understand BBNJ, we need to know the history and the legal background. In 1994, a legal framework, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, UNCLOS came into force. I believe our audience are more familiar with climate issues. To understand UNCLOS in a simple way, it acts similarly as the UNFCCC. They are both major UN framework agreements establishing international legal regimes, one for climate change and the UNCLOS for the sea. They are both overarching and they provide a foundation for more specific protocols and treaties. And many of you are aware, after the establishment of UNFCCC, it was the protocols and agreements that specify the areas that contracting parties need to contribute to, like the Kyoto Protocols made in 1997 and the Paris Agreement made in 2015. Under the UNCLOS, again, the United Nations Conventions of the Law of the Sea, there are also several agreements. For example, the 1994 Implementation Agreement started the whole branch of the deep sea management and led to the establishment of a new UN organization, the International Seabed Authority. In 2001, the UN Fish Stock Agreement was also established to ensure the long-term conservation and sustainable use of straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. From what I just introduced, our audience must have got a sense. While not entirely lawless, the high seas do not see biodiversity as a priority. The BBNJ Treaty now provides a more comprehensive global framework to manage these critical areas, considering both its conservation and sustainable use.
So can you tell us about the major highlights of this BBNJ treaty?
Well, the BBNJ Treaty addresses several critical challenges related to the high seas. In simple words, conventional conventions aim to protect fish stocks, while the BBNJ aims to regulate the use of the resources like a single fish and its areas. BBNJ Treaty aspires to close the gap in governance for the areas beyond national jurisdiction and enable more coordinated and effective action on key issues. Usually, the experts see four major pillars in the BBNJ under conservation and sustainable use. The first one is, we call it MGRs, marine genetic resources, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from their use. Thus addresses how the scientific and the potential commercial benefits of genetic materials from the high sea organisms can be shared, particularly with the developing countries. The second thing is the APMTs, area-based management tools, such as the establishment of marine protected areas, the most commonly known way for APMT. This provides a mechanism to create protected areas in international waters, which is expected to be a major component of conservation efforts like the 30 by 30 target. It is the protection of 30% of the ocean by 2030. And EIAs, environmental impact assessment for activities planned in areas beyond the national jurisdiction. This mandates that potential impacts of human beings, for example, deep sea mining and shipping, etc., on the high sea biodiversities need to be assessed before they proceed. And finally, the capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. This aspect focuses on providing developing nations with the necessary scientific knowledge, technical skills, and the financial resources to participate in the marine science and implement the treaty effectively.
Yes, but the treaty actually took about 20 years to negotiate before finally being adopted in 2023, and then another 2 years to reach this ratification threshold. What were the hardest issues to resolve, and why was consensus so difficult?
Well, reaching consensus requires skillful compromises that preserved nations' national interests while creating the first ever global framework to protect biodiversity in nearly half of the planet. Fortunately, the delegation and the chairpersons have successfully achieved that. I think the toughest issues were the ones that touched money, power, and sovereignty. So the key debates focus on who gets the economic benefits, whether it is the companies, the nations, or the whole humankind, and how to define that. and it focuses on who gets to make decisions. It is the conference of parties, the countries, or the companies who claim how much they have earned and how to share, and who has authority over the activities in global commons. So here are the very tricky questions that has been long debated over. So let's talk about this later. We can break down all those questions and see how much detail we can explain.
Yes, sure. Just now you mentioned the four pillars of this treaty, and I guess we can dig deeper into them. And one of them is the ability to create marine protected areas on the high seas. Can you walk us through how that process will actually look like?
Yeah, of course. Well, the BBN Treaty actually originated from the idea of creating areas for protections on the high seas. Well, this area can be a strict marine protected areas or other measures. Now the dream has the potential to come true. In the BBNJ Treaty, there's a quite big chunk of articles defining such areas. Well, the process starts from a proposal phase. Parties can propose individually or collectively to the Secretariat to initiate the process. It is noteworthy to mention that the proposal should be formulated on the basis of the best available science and, if possible, relevant traditional knowledge of indigenous people and the local communities should be taken into account. This might include identifying unique ecosystems, for example, the hydrothermal vents, deep sea coral reefs, etc., or crucial habitats for migratory species like the whales, sharks, and sea turtles. The tricky part here is, unlike terrestrial and coastal systems where human beings have long been studying, the knowledge gap on the high seas are huge. The best available science could be just several navigations in several seasons. So this is very challenging, but the BBN Treaty acknowledges challenges and propose that the proposing parties need to do the proposal based on the best available science. The next step is simple. The Secretariat shall make the proposal publicly available and transmit into the scientific and technical body for a preliminary review so that the basic requirements can be met. For example, if the proposed high sea MPA is under a disputed water area, the proposal thus does not meet the criteria of beyond sovereign jurisdiction. And then comes the entrée, the consultation and assessment of the proposal. Who are the key reviewers? Firstly, the states. In particular, adjacent coastal states shall be notified and invited to submit feedback. Secondly, bodies of relevant legal instruments and frameworks and other relevant global, regional, sub-regional, or sectoral bodies should be notified and invited to comment. For example, the RFMOs, the fishery governance organizations, they also cover the high seas, so their opinions are also critical in making the decisions as establishing an MPAs. Thirdly, indigenous people and local communities with the relevant traditional knowledge, the scientific community, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders shall be consulted. Believe it or not, they may possess much knowledge and insights beyond our imagination. I have talked to several of them, I mean the indigenous people. They tell me that they can just watch the whales and tell the situation of the waves around their islands. So their knowledge is invaluable, and they must have the entry point to get to review these proposals. And finally, the Conference of Parties has the right to decide whether to establish an area-based management tool such as an MPA. It will consider the relevant legal instruments, frameworks, and relationship with other bodies. As a desert to mark a happy end of the enjoyable meal, a consensus is expected among all parties. However, if all efforts to reach consensus have been exhausted, decisions can also be made by voting.
Well, are there specific biodiversity hotspots on the high seas that countries are already discussing for protection under this treaty?
Yes, there are quite a few. Let me just introduce one, the Sargasso Sea. It is a unique region in the North Atlantic. It's named after the floating sargassum seaweed that forms large mats on the surface. A very interesting fact is it is the only named sea without land boundaries. I call it a sea-locked sea surrounded by only four other currents, just like a landlocked country that it is surrounded by other countries. And I guess it is also new to many of our audience. Yes, seas also have their boundaries. The Sargasso Sea poses biodiversity significance because it supports a unique ecosystem that provides breeding and nursery grounds for species like the Atlantic bluefin tuna, eels, and sea turtles. It is also home to a rich diversity of less symbolic marine species, including various fish, invertebrates, and birds. That depends on the floating mats of the Sargassum seaweed for food, shelter, and breeding sites. Unfortunately, the Sargasso Sea faces threats like overfishing, particularly the tuna and eel, as you can imagine, pollution, especially from the plastic waste and chemical runoff, and the potential impacts of the climate change, which could alter the ocean currents and disrupt ecosystems. Therefore, the high sea areas of the Sargasso Sea are seen as a potential target for a regional MPA under the BBNJ framework.
Well, the treaty also requires nations to share marine genetic resources found in high seas. What exactly are these MGRs and why are they so valuable?
Well, if you go to a department store, you will find that cosmetics with names or ingredients regarding the seas are usually more expensive. That is something related to the marine genetic resources, MGRs, and benefit sharing. Technically, MGRs refer to the genetic material found in marine organisms, including like the plants, animals, microorganisms, and other life forms that can be utilized for various scientific, medical, and industrial purposes. That's also the term I always call it a single fish. In simple words, it is the value that you can get from not a net of fish, but a single fish, not only for its meat, but for its contents, like the genetic resources. These resources possess and demonstrate huge potential for significant scientific, medical, and commercial value. So why is it that special? They contain unique biological adaptations found nowhere else to date. Life in the deep ocean of high seas need to survive under very extreme conditions like the high pressure, low temperature, total darkness, low nutrient availability, high salinity, and sometimes chemical extremes like the hydrothermal vents. And these extreme environments forces organisms to evolve unique biochemical pathways, proteins, enzymes, and metabolic tricks that are unlike anything on the terrestrial life. And these could include enzymes that work at high temperatures or the heat-stable enzyme from the vent bacteria. Because of these traits, these species often have enormous commercial potential. Several industries have already been using MGRs, like the pharmaceutical, like cosmetics, biotechnology, etc. Let's take the Taq polymerase as example. This is an enzyme which revolutionized the PCR technology. During the PCR test, a critical process is to amplify the small amount of sample taken from a patient to a large quantity enough for tests. And the Taq polymerase, the enzyme, has a charming trait. It works only best at the temperature of 94 degrees Celsius. This makes it very controllable and therefore widely used. This enzyme is originated from a microbe in a hot spring in the Yellowstone Park, where the water temperature is 94 degrees. Mm-hmm. So now you can understand and imagine similar MGRs from deep sea are expected to revolutionize again the biotechnology industry. So that's why it is very, very, I would say, lubricant to explore the MGRs in the high seas.
Okay, but I think a big debate here was about fairness because who actually benefits when some valuable discoveries like a new cancer drug are made in parts of the ocean that legally belong to everyone? I mean, how satisfied are you that this treaty finally got that balance right?
Well, yes, there's a debate between the developed countries and developing countries, or to be more specific, between the countries with MGR exploration capacity and without. The countries with the strong capacity of using MGRs, typically developed countries, are often concerned about restrictions or the restrictions on access to these resources, fearing that global regulations could hinder innovation and research. On the other hand, it is obvious that all resources from high sea belong to the entire humankind. Considering the different development level of MGR use, developing countries argue that countries and communities without direct access to the high sea should benefit from any discoveries made in these waters, especially since they may hold genetic resources that could be valuable for research, biotechnology, or medicine. Here are several questions that people can think about. So who bears the responsibility to share? And is the individual company or the hosting country? And who and what to share? Is it the profit, the genetic sequence, or the technology? And moreover, it is equally important to define what is the equitable sharing. So your specific question is even more complicated. I mean, a cancer drug. It adds another dimension of medical ethics. From my point of view, I wish there could be a balanced scenario among pharmaceutical companies, patients, and third-party countries where all can benefit from the MGRs. Probably an ideal picture could be companies keep a reasonable part of profit, patients get killed, and applied technologies be shared with other countries. I know it's too ideal, but these are aspects we need to consider if we individuals hope to benefit from MGRs in a sustainable way.
Yeah, and this actually reminds me of the race for resource in outer space, which, according to the Outer Space Treaty, should belong to everyone. But in practice, only a few technologically advanced countries are able to explore, and NASA's been using terms like lunar gold rush. So is the benefit sharing part of the treaty real money for the global south, or is it more of a diplomatic victory that looks good on paper but won't deliver much in practice? Or perhaps will depend largely on the generosity of wealthy nations?
The Outer Space Treaty emphasized the free exploration and use by all states. It's just like the first come, first serve, or first come, first get. And there's no mandatory benefit sharing obligation. Before the BBNJ Treaty, the resources in the high seas, with the exception of fishery activities under the IFMOs, follow a similar scenario. The free exploration use, right? And now, thanks to the treaty, the marine genetic resources of the high seas are a part of the global commons, thus creating a specific operational benefit sharing obligations. This treaty explicitly explains that benefit sharing is mandatory and includes both monetary payments into a global fund and non-monetary sharings like technology transfer, capacity building, shared samples, joint research, and access to genetic sequence data, etc. So this is a far more detailed than the OST, the Outer Space Treaty.
Okay, but if the benefits must be shared, if this is mandatory, does it encourage innovation or risk slowing it down?
Well, this is a very interesting question. So while neither 100% share or none to share is possible, we must find a balance, a best balance between them. Let's explore the factors that will slow the innovation. It is no doubt that to share the benefits, the first step is to establish a system to define the sharing frameworks and the implementation guidance. Following these sharing requirements requires huge transaction costs. For example, the need for permissions and negotiations over the benefit sharing agreements could slow down the ability to access and exploit marine genetic resources quickly. If companies must navigate complex international regulations, licensing fees, and profit sharing schemes, it could make research more costly and time-consuming, particularly for the startups or small enterprises working on biotech innovations. Meanwhile, uncertainties around intellectual property in relation to MGI is another concern. Such uncertainty could make potential investors and innovators hesitant to invest in research on marine resources. Just imagine if the ownership of any new discoveries or products derived from MGRs is unclear or subject to international agreements, who would dare to invest their stakes into the resource or projects? However, there are also encouragement for innovation. First, it encourages collaborative research among countries. That gives the developing countries the opportunity to catch up and develop their capacity in acquiring MGR or utilizing them. For example, a biotech firm from a developed country may partner with a research institute in a developing country that has access to marine ecosystems, leading to innovative solutions that would be difficult to achieve in isolation. And benefit sharing also leads to sustainable innovation. When sharing requirements are low, companies or countries may focus on their own interests and thus leads to short-term exploitation, very common. However, when sharing plays a major part in the use, the stakeholders must consider eco-friendly biotech solutions, which will bring long-term profit. And no doubt, when these companies or countries realize that the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution are the challenges to their profits, they will try their best to make right decisions for sustainability.
Environmental impact assessment are another core pillar. How will the treaty change the way countries and companies have to think before doing anything in international waters?
Well, the BBNJ treaties introduced for the first time a global standard requiring countries and companies to thoroughly assess and publicly disclose environmental impacts before carrying out many activities in international waters. This is a major shift from the system. And now, the activities that may harm the marine environment must undergo an EIA, environmental impact assessment. Before the treaty, countries decide for themselves whether a project needs an EIA, and many activities never went through one. Under the BBNJ, an EIA is required when an activity causes substantial pollution or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This can affect industries like the deep sea scientific research involving sampling or the equipment left on the seabed, marine biotechnology prospecting, offshore energy experiments, laying new cables or pipelines in the ecological sensitive areas, etc. Moreover, thanks to the BBNJ Treaty, EIAs must follow international minimum standards. Previously, states could use their own criteria. Some had strong environmental laws, others had almost none. Now, the treaty sets a common global baseline. The whole Part 4, a good 13 articles, depicted the EIA process and requirements in details. That includes standardized steps for assessing impacts, biodiversity and ecosystem baseline studies, consideration of cumulative impacts, consultation, mitigation methods, monitoring and management plans, and public disclosures, etc.
Well, actually, the treaty does not include hard enforcement or sanctions, and some worry this might impact effective implementation. So, in your view, is this a weakness or a necessary compromise to get more countries on board?
Yeah, you're right. The absence of hard enforcement mechanisms or sanctions in the BBNJ Treaty is a significant point of concern for many observers, and it is possible that countries or companies could flout the provisions of the treaty. Here, I won't spend time to explain why lack of enforcement could be a weakness because it is easy to imagine. Instead, I would be realistic, trying to explain why the current situation is an acceptable compromise. First of all, the BBNJ Treaty was negotiated over 2 decades and required broad consensus across countries with diverse interests, ranging from heavily industrialized nations to small island states that rely on healthy marine ecosystems. The existence of such a treaty is more critical than its perfection, and there's no guarantee that conservationists and negotiators can get a more positive treaty by spending more years on it. Secondly, it is more encouraging to promote cooperation than imposing punishment. We have talked about the benefit sharing right now. In fact, if there is cooperation among nations through shared governance, capacity building, and technical support, these implementers will positively think of the sustainable use of high sea resources, which is the ultimate goal behind the treaty. Such sustainability can be achieved through incentives instead of punishments. Thirdly, let's look into the world. How many environmental treaties have hard enforcements? In fact, very rare. The only one I am familiar with is the CITES Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. It is commonly known as the treaty with teeth, and its conference of parties are always filled with strong debates. Okay, so that's a privilege for it, and I have to say it is successful, but just think about all the resources that is required behind the treaty. And let's think about the rest and the majority. I'm quite confident that our audience is familiar with UNFCCC, probably the Convention of Biological Diversity, and the three conventions on pollution, including Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm. They all guide countries to make positive changes without hard enforcement. One can argue that there are specific requirements, but I would say no countries will be punished or will face sanction because of failing to implement these conventions. And among the environmental treaties, I would specifically mention the Ramsar Convention, the one on the wetlands of international importance. In fact, I used to be the China NGO focal point for the Ramsar Convention when I was working on the wetlands. When a country finds one of its Ramsar sites or its wetland of international importance degraded, the only action it is required to take is to report. There's no punishment at all. However, that does not hinder, for example, China to march forward to its wetland restoration. In fact, according to the official figure, by the end of the 13th five-year plan, China has protected more than half of its wetlands. And lastly, let's be a bit philosophic. So the high seas and the public area among the public welfare owners. It is very hard to designate and maintain a law reinforcement body. So it is simply impossible to implement strong and hard enforcement. Therefore, I guess let's grant some trust to the leaders in all countries and mobilize incentives to encourage the sustainability instead of trying to punish them for not following the requirements.
Okay. Finally, are there some targets or milestones we should watch for? Like, what would success look like for this treaty?
Well, technically, a session for the preparatory commission for the BBNJ agreement or PrepCom will be held in late March 2026. The state parties will complete the institutional, procedural, and technical groundwork needed for the treaty to start functioning in practice. Once the 2026 session is done and the groundwork is laid, the treaty will be operational for the first time, meaning that from then on, the countries and companies will actually have to follow the rules. Again, it's on the ABMT or the MPA's marine protected areas, the EIA's environment impact assessments, benefit sharing, etc. It's no more just on paper. And after that, we would expect the first conference of party in late 2026 or early 2027. So this is the things that we will see in the future. And in terms of the success, well, from my point of view, first of all, I hope the treaty can be well followed, well implemented. So this is the minimum requirement, and I hope the BBNJ treaty can eventually designate enough high CMPAs and substantially contribute to the 30 by 30 target. We don't have much time left. There are only 5 years before the global need to reach this target. There's still a big gap, and the BBNJ treaty should be able to play a very large role. And I hope the BBNJ treaty can encourage the sustainable use of high sea MGRs, and more companies and countries can work together for this and really realizing the sustainable use of the high sea resources.
Okay, thank you, Yimo. Thank you so much for joining us today. And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cttn.com with your questions or feedback. and stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.